We are now into Unit 3, and what happens in Key Concept 3.1 is the French and Indian War, which took place from 1754 to 1763 between Great Britain and her Native American allies, and France and her Native American allies. And what happens as a result of the French and Indian War is that the national debt of Great Britain is doubled from 73 million to about 137 million. Taxes are levied against the colonists who don't have any representation in the British Parliament. And so what eventually happens at the end of the Key Concept 3.1 notes here is that a Revolutionary War breaks out between Great Britain and the British colonists. So it's really more of a civil war than anything else. And before we really get into that, we're going to talk first about the events that led to the French and Indian War, which were westward expansion into the interior of North America, which threatened French and Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. So here we go. France built Fort Duquesne in present-day Pittsburgh after Virginia land speculators and Pennsylvania fur traders moved into the Ohio River Valley. Robert Dinwiddie, the royal governor of Virginia, asserted the colony's jurisdiction there and promoted his own interest in a company of land speculators determined to sell Ohio Valley lands to settlers. Dinwiddie sent a small contingent of troops led by fellow speculator George Washington. Washington attacked a French patrol, but was compelled to surrender on July 4th when his crudely constructed fort was surrounded. The French and Indian War was fought between France, England, and their respective native allies for control of the disputed area between the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley. Native Americans residing in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions were allied with France because of their previously existing relationships through trading and marriage. The Iroquois Nation were allied with the British. As war approached, Benjamin Franklin, representative for the colonies in England and the publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, proposed the Albany Plan of Union, a plan to conceive of the colonies as a whole entity. The Albany Plan was not conceived of a desire to secure independence from Great Britain, but out of an urgent need for cooperation of colonies likely to come under attack or invasion. By spring 1756, Lenni Lenape and Shawnee raiders had killed or captured 700 settlers. The survivors abandoned their farms and their flight pushed the frontier back to within 100 miles of Philadelphia. In 1754, to recoup Washington's setback, General Edward Braddock marched 2,200 regular and colonial troops against Fort Duquesne. Braddock, lacking the native allies he needed, was arrogant and unwilling to adapt to war in the American forests, expressing contempt for both Indians and colonists. Braddock was included in the 1,000 killed or wounded by the French, who suffered only 40 casualties. William Pitt dramatically increased colonial cooperation by reimbursing colonial expenditures in cash. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War, but victory had not come cheap, doubling the British debt from a pre-war £73 million to a post-war $137 million. Interest payments alone consumed more than 60% of Great Britain's annual budgets during the mid-1760s. Colonial traders followed the British into the Ohio and Great Lakes countries. Most cheated and abused Indians in pursuit of immediate profit rather than cultivating long-term relationships as the French had. Because the Treaty of Paris brought the Ohio, Illinois, and Great Lakes regions under British control, American Indians suffered the loss of their French allies, along with encroachment of British settlers. Nealon encouraged Native Americans to reject British manufactures and alcohol, and turn back to traditional cultural, social, and technological processes. In 1763, Native peoples captured most of the forts in the newly controlled British territory and raided settlements in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, killing or capturing 2,000 colonists, hoping to lure the French back into North America. The British, preferred to blame Indian rebellions on a single mastermind called the uprising Pontiac's Rebellion after a prominent Ottawa chief, but Native peoples rose up for their own reasons with no central command. At the end of the French and Indian War, colonists were ordered by the Proclamation of 1763 not to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, and those who were there periodically evacuated. This proved a non-deterrent. The Crown issued the proclamation for 3 reasons. 1, the British were spending a lot of money defending the western edges of the empire in North America. 2, people were leaving coastal cities which were the main centers of export. And 3, the British Crown, rather than land speculators and entrepreneurs and determined settlers, wanted to control business opportunities. Although 10,000 troops were stationed in frontier forts, colonists largely ignored the order, leading to continuous conflict, heightened tensions, and skirmishes over land disputes. During the years 1607 to 1763, the British had allowed colonial legislatures to exist, pass laws, collect taxes, and basically dictate daily life in British North America without interference. This was known as salutary neglect. Because of the enormous debt created by the French and Indian War expenditures, the British attempted to reassert control in North America through a series of taxes. Keeping in mind that the colonies had no representation in Parliament, these taxes came at the same time that an economic depression set in the colonies. They included the Revenue Act of 1762, which tried to end colonial bribery of customs officials and rampant smuggling which had defied the Navigation Acts for generations. The Currency Act of 1764 banned colonies from using paper money to prevent worthless paper from paying debts. When Parliament forbade further issues of paper money, incomes fell and creditors sued for collection just when debtors found it most difficult to pay. Public and private debts, a depression, and surging litigation made the colonists resent the new policies and taxes. 3 additional taxes meant to raise revenue to pay the debt accumulated during the French and Indian War were the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on sugar from 6 to 3 cents a pound, but created courts which tried smugglers without a trial by jury. The law also allowed for searches without a warrant to seek violations. The Stamp Act attempted to directly tax colonists by putting a tax on anything that might be printed, including newspapers, land titles, slave sales, legal documents, books, dice, diplomas, liquor licenses, every advertisement, every almanac, every deck of cards. If Parliament had tried to find a way to anger every colony and every social class, they couldn't have done a better job. And the Quartering Act of 1765, which required colonial assemblies to house and feed British troops stationed in their colonies, a wartime measure which colonies had always resisted, which was placed upon them in peacetime. Colonists, resentful and angry over the taxes, called for political action to resist the measures. In 1764, Boston's town meeting protested parliamentary taxation. This annihilates our right to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes at our British privileges, which we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us without ever having a legal representation, are we not reduced from free subjects to slaves? The Sons of Liberty, led by Sam Adams and John Hancock, ensured that boycotts of British goods were being enforced while threatening or committing acts of physical violence against British customs officials. Customs agents were tarred and feathered. By 1765, the Stamp Act was repealed. The Townshend Acts were a tax whose revenue would go to government officials independent of colonial control, and the Massachusetts Assembly reacted by sending circular letters to their neighboring colonial assemblies, called so because it would be read, then sent on to the next one, demanding the end to taxation without representation in British Parliament. British regular troops were stationed in Boston as a result of the circular letter, which led to the Boston Massacre. Increased taxes coincided with a post-war economic depression. Paul Revere's engraving, The Boston Massacre, pictured on the bottom right, is a classic example of political propaganda, but it does show us that colonial British relations had deteriorated to the point that colonists were assaulting soldiers who were forced to defend themselves. We'll be listening to the first 4 minutes of the Washington Post Constitutional podcast to set the scene. John Adams, the future president, defended the British troops charged with manslaughter after the Boston Massacre, and his defense led to an acquittal. Colonists burned the Gaspee in Rhode Island in 1772 down to the waterline, and Sam Adams created colonial committees of correspondence, an informal communications network between the colonial legislatures. The fact of their communication again illustrates deteriorating colonial British relations. The Tea Act of 1773 lowered the price of tea from 6 to 3 cents a pound, but created a monopoly for the British East India Company, which led colonists to react by dumping the modern equivalent of $4 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor. In response, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Port, annulled Massachusetts' charter, banned town meetings, enforced the Quartering Act, and allowed British officials to try Massachusetts for crimes rather than local trial. The Quebec Act of 1774 gave the Ohio Valley to French Canadians, infuriating Virginians and Pennsylvanians, as well as protected the rights of practicing Roman Catholics. The British had captured all of New France during the French and Indian War, and colonists surely would not have forgotten the lives lost in the process. Colonists saw this as the diminishing of lands available for settlement and interpreted the protections for Catholics as an opening to rule of North America by the Pope, or even worse, the establishment of an Anglican bishop for North America. In response to the continued taxation without representation, the colonists convened a Continental Congress in 1774. Representatives from 12 colonies, excluding Georgia, who didn't endorse the actions of the Continental Congress, met in Philadelphia in 1774 and passed a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which called for repeal of the Coercive Acts, a new boycott of British goods, and threatened to stop exporting. At the Second Continental Congress, the Continental Army was created with George Washington at its head. The Olive Branch Petition was sent to King George, who refused to even read it, and colonies voted for independence. Pictured on the bottom right is Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. British troops were marching to Concord to confiscate a cache of colonial weapons and were descended upon by 2,000 militiamen, firing upon them during their 18-mile march back to Boston. The event inspired Henry Wadsworth Longfellow to compose the poem Paul Revere's Ride, a colonial who warned the regulars are coming, made famous more so due to the fact that Revere rhymes with here in the poem. The colonists did not show great marksmanship that day. As many as 3,500 militiamen, firing constantly for 18 miles, only killed or wounded roughly 250 redcoats. Colonists without representation in Parliament were reluctant to pay taxes levied in order to create revenue for the British Empire. Enlightenment thinking and the consequences to a ruler for violating the social contract, and Thomas Paine's ridiculing of the British monarchy in his pamphlet Common Sense, was a catalyst of convincing substantial numbers of Americans that independence was a good idea. All of the above were factors that drove the move towards independence. Those agitating for revolution believed that taxation without representation violated their protections as British subjects. Revolutionary leaders would have read John Locke's ideas about the right to life, liberty, and property, and the consequences for a ruler that violated those natural rights. The Whig political faction believed in the power of Parliament over monarchy or anti-debt, anti-taxes, for small government, and fearful of a standing army, also drove paranoia in the colonies. American independence was energized by leaders such as Benjamin Franklin and by popular movements that included the political activism of laborers, artisans, and women. James Otis, a Massachusetts assemblyman, and his sister Mercy Otis Warren each made efforts to advance the cause of independence. Otis fought against British writs of assistance, the process of searching a home without a warrant. Otis's sister was a poet whose works encouraged colonial men to take a more militant stance towards England. Samuel Adams organized the Sons of Liberty, whose clandestine membership reached nearly 300, to protest the passage of the Stamp Act. John Dickinson wrote the Olive Branch Petition and later the Articles of Confederation, America's first governing document. Additional revolutionary leaders include George Washington, who kept the Continental Army going despite many early losses, and whose decision to step away after 2 presidential terms set a precedent that lasted until 1940. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, and Abigail Adams, who reminded her husband John to be mindful of women's rights at the Continental Congress in 1776, at which she presumed the Congress was drafting a new code of laws. Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts of British goods, including tea and cloth, and put social pressure on men to embrace the Patriot cause. After the fighting broke out in 1775, loyalists to the Patriot cause, about 2/3 of the colonists, participated through boycotts, homespun cloth making, closing courts to prevent land seizures, paying of taxes to Patriot governments, donating supplies, running family farms in the absence of their husbands. Some free blacks fought for the Continental Army, some enslaved for the British who offered freedom upon victory. Both women and men joined the army as camp followers, cooking, cleaning, and acting as nurses. The Continental Army was underfed, overtired, bedraggled, and in many cases ready to desert. After 1775, Washington was given the powers of a military dictatorship, which meant deserters were shot, and those disobeying orders were flogged. Despite losing 6 of 9 major battles, a victory at Saratoga in New York brought a French offer of military, financial, and naval support, along with the assistance of the Marquis de Lafayette. A Prussian soldier, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, also drilled Continental troops into fighting condition. It is interesting to note that in the boat in which Washington crossed the Delaware River also were James Madison, James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, and